Okay, so this is Dawson Gage, and we're following on a long 20-minute introduction in which I set the stage for my riffs on Josh Stein's. Excuse me, I'm listening to the people upstairs and all on house arrest. My parents, that is, who support Mr. Stein and who have given him money and who, it's ridiculous at this point. The gubernatorial race in North Carolina has torn me apart from my own family, or at least the ones that are Democrats. Like my dear mother, who is not just a Democrat but the Democrat in North Carolina, and yet Mr. Stein appears to think that my mother will choose him over her son. I don't mean to put it in such melodramatic terms, but that does appear to be what he's saying. In any event, these are some other things which he is saying, and you can credit when it's one thing to be wrong in what you say. It's another thing to be wrong in what you don't say and what you exclude. And so we should criticize Mr. Stein not only for the absurdity and ridiculousness and offensiveness of what he says. I mean, for somebody who is considered to be highly educated, everything he says is mind-bogglingly stupid and condescending, as we will see here. It might seem, just to make it clear, it might seem as though I'm not trying to espouse the opposite view or to give credence to the views of Mark Robinson. But if Mark Robinson is your standard, like if all you have to do to be considered the better candidate is to beat Mark Robinson or to be better than him, if that's your standard, you're not really saying very much about yourself, are you? But of course, Mr. Stein not only says the most vicious and disrespectful things about the lieutenant governor of North Carolina, who how did Josh Stein get his job? Slight majority of North Carolinians voted for him. But how did Mr. Robinson get his job? Slight majority of North Carolinians voted for him. Different majority, yes, indeed. Was there some overlap? Very, very little. A few eccentric people, ticket splitters. It's a different kind of ticket splitting because it's a very different couple of tickets. And, my experience as a 36-year-old North Carolinian who's lived elsewhere as well, but not very much, is that the real issue is not that Mark Robinson is a demon or a barbarian or a nut or whatever, or that he's not intelligent or that he's not educated. I don't presume to say and just say sort of things about somebody because that's a very low level of political rhetoric. Just simply say the things that Josh Stein says and act as if that's good enough. It's not good enough, and this is why. Quote from Josh Stein. He calls public school teachers wicked people and demons and says that gay people are filth. And even worse than that, he mocks school shooting survivors, calling them media prostitutes. Okay, let's just try to deconstruct this. He calls public school teachers wicked people and demons. I myself spent 2 years. I'm inclined to say that much of what Mr. Stein and his factions say in public has to be interpreted in a kind of passive-aggressive, oblique attack on their principal critic, Dawson Gage. And so, I don't want to disparage people who went to public school because the most important education is the one which people give themselves through independent study, which reflects one's not what the schools force you to do, but what you yourself as a student, as a young boy or girl, as a man and woman, choose to do. That learning is lifelong and must be driven by the inner desire of the child or of the adult man or woman to learn. And so I don't believe that the school system is necessarily a good thing, or at least the only good thing, in that it has just as much in it which is oppressive and ugly and and completely incompatible with human nature. Has Mr. Stein never heard the song "We don't need no education, we don't need no thought control, no dark sarcasm in the classroom, teacher, leave those kids alone, hey, teacher, leave them kids alone"? But no, Mr. Stein thinks that we're all in all just bricks in his wall. It would seem to be the case. So just because Mark Robinson says that public school teachers are evil or wicked, honestly, I thought the same thing when I was in public school. And that's because I went not just to private school, but to Montessori school and to parochial school, which is different from private school, and to prep school and boarding school, which is different from day school. And in fact, I basically went to the best schools, and this hasn't gotten me anywhere in life in North Carolina, where you'd think that these people pretend to value education, and yet I'm the worst treated, most oppressed and abused person in North Carolina, even though I pretty much have the best education. Is it a coincidence? Doesn't matter. Point being that even if it's not explicitly because of my education that I've been persecuted, which I believe it is, it ought to be the case that the education, which should be recognized when you write to people complaining about injustice and oppression and the denial of basic liberties and the violation of international law or whatever. As I've said to other people, international law ought to be something which, when you hear about it, it gives you pause. Because if you have to call on international law, it means there's a problem with your own state, in your own country, in your own jurisdiction. This is what people in dictatorships overseas have recognized for a long time. And in some countries, people have learned to admit, yes, indeed, our country is lacking and defective when it comes to international law. Say people in sub-Saharan Africa, or in critics in Thailand or Myanmar, or even in Japan, will sometimes invoke international law, often invoke international law. In North Carolina, you say international law and they send you to Cherry Hospital. But anyways, my first criticism was about Josh Stein's, naive remark about school teachers. I mean, does he say school teachers are all good, or that school teachers are all virtuous? I think this is true. Or in any event, the problem is if we grant this, so as I've said in my introduction, I very much believe in the fundamental values of the North Carolina Democratic Party as I was brought up, in which education is number one. That's what North Carolina Democrat means to me. That education is the most important thing, and that the whole policy of the state and of the party and everything else should be to encourage education, starting with early childhood education and leading all the way up to higher education. And so the idea in North Carolina is basically a social democratic one, to use a word which we don't use, but people in Germany are there's a bug on the fan. People in Germany or California or Sweden or whatever can all kind of recognize that North Carolina's universities are good enough to be considered social democratic. Our primary schools and secondary schools are not considered to be up to that social democratic level. And the reason is because they're not very good. I don't mean that, I guess I mean in particular that the people who are considered elite students in North Carolina are lacking in basic literacy as well as knowledge of history, geography, and in what in some contexts is called critical thinking, independent thinking. That the better test scores and the better grades you get from the most highly ranked North Carolina high schools, with some exceptions, what you see is that people get more and more conformist, more and more bourgeois. And this, unfortunately, you see that at a young age. And this is the dynamic that David Brooks observed, as described as the organization kid back when I was in prep school. But in any event, this gives me, Josh Stein says that public school teachers are good and virtuous always, and I guess he might have gone to public schools in North Carolina as Democrat politicians inevitably brag. The point being that while public school and publicly funded school and school for all people, available to all people, open to all people, all children, and universities which are universally available and affordable, as they no longer are, but as the Constitution in North Carolina requires, the values of education to which Mr. Stein pays lip service are true values in North Carolina. But the problem is that he pays them only lip service, and it's a very peculiar and as I say, in fact, hideous form of lip service, because he does not know what he even means. Continuing with the statement, he refers Mr. Stein, he's criticizing Mark Robinson, or trying to. He calls public school teachers wicked people and demons, and says that gay people are filth. And even worse than that, he mocks school shooting survivors, calling them media prostitutes. I, of course, I have not heard Mark Robinson's remark. I do believe that he said something like what Josh Stein is saying. I do believe he might have said wicked and demon about public school teachers, and I do believe that he might have said filth about gays and lesbians, perhaps referring to the somewhat different category of transgender persons. But point being that Mr. Stein would like to count on and really sort of dial it up when it comes to the so-called gay vote, or the LGBTQ vote. But in my view, Mr. Stein is not deserving of this constituency, even as those who align themselves against the LGBTQ, perspective within the Democratic Party, and generally the Republicans who are opposed to all these LGBTQ politics issues. It's worth pointing out that, and I say this as somebody who describes himself as a lesbian male or a lesbian man, just because you practice certain sexual or romantic or romantic religious lifestyle practices, just because you do a certain thing or feel a certain way or have a certain idea of love and sex and so on, doesn't mean that you support Joshua Stein, or that you're going to. I mean, just because a politician says certain things, like says certain keywords or whatever, who claims like, oh yes, we believe in love, being an uncritical, sort of moronic, I can remember being very offended when I saw, when I heard President Biden use the word to draw contrast with gays, lesbians, and etc. When you heard President Biden using the word heterosexual, and he said it in this old kind of querulous sort of way, but it was clear, to make my point, that when President Biden speaks of gay, lesbian, and then uses the contrary term heterosexual, a Democrat is no longer allowed to, or in any event encouraged to, say the word homosexual. And yet President Biden can use the word heterosexual, and Josh Stein pretends that he can talk about, not just about gay and lesbian relationships and gay and lesbian marriage and gay and lesbian 50B, but he thinks that he can also talk in the same breath about rape, about womanhood, about domestic violence, about stalking, about sexual abuse, the sexual abuse of minors, about the sexual exploitation of adults, about human trafficking, about sexual servitude, about prostitution. Mr. Stein is claiming as Attorney General for this period of time, following on the heels of Rick Cooper, who had been Attorney General for another 16 years, that these two men in North Carolina, between them, have been the end-all be-all of our understanding of sex and law in the 21st century, where we supposedly have gotten more enlightened and more advanced, but in fact, we have not. So let me draw attention to the other ridiculous thing about this statement. Josh Stein says not only does he ranks his statements that Mark Robinson made, which are supposedly each intolerable or uncomfortable, when in fact I myself would never repeat or would never have myself said these words that Mark Robinson said. I would not have said public school teachers are wicked, although of course some of them are ridiculous and some of them are not very smart, even stupid. I would not have called public school teachers demons, although if I had to go through public school again as a young child in North Carolina, which are when the public schools are often so stifling or whatever, these are the same schools where teachers, in my experience, the problem with the schools in North Carolina, and here I can make my own. As I say, I have always believed very strongly, dare I say fanatically and religiously and, obsessively in education, and have never done anything in my life but study and learn, as Vladimir Lenin told young people in the Soviet Union to do. Education is not a bourgeois value. It is a traditional value as well as a modernistic and a socialist and a communist and a Marxist one. Marxists believe more fanatically in education than anybody else, and yet Mr. Stein does not think that communist or Marxist or socialist or left-wing books should be available in public school libraries. This whole question of banning books and supposedly makes the Republicans look bad. But frankly, the Democrats are responsible for much more oppressive and reprehensible and illegal book bans than the Republicans are. It's one thing to ban books about gay sexuality in elementary schools. It's another thing to ban books about prisons in prison. And that's what they do in North Carolina. It's another thing to ban books by Russian right wing political philosophers. It's another thing to ban books by ancient Chinese military strategists. It's another thing to ban books by popular, like sort of pop cultural, pop psychological theories. It's another thing to ban Toni Morrison and Sigmund Freud and George R.R. Martin in North Carolina jails and prisons. It's another thing to ban Playboy magazine. It's another thing to ban, Black Biker magazine. It's another. If you had a list of the banned publications in North Carolina jails and prisons maintained by the Department of Public Safety, if you've seen that list, and I saw it on the kiosk at the Alamance County Jail where it was available to let you know what books we couldn't have, and of course, people had the banned books. People in Alamance Jail had 48 Laws of Power. They had A Feast for Crows, by whatever's name that wrote the Laws of Power, or George R.R. Martin, Game of Thrones, etc., etc. It's frankly a lot more offensive to say that men in prison, in jail, can't read Game of Thrones than to say that elementary school students can't read books about sex. If elementary school students want to find books about sex, and yes, indeed, I was searching for books about sex in the 3rd and 4th grade. But I didn't expect to find the books about sex in the library